Welcome, like I said, to this virtual talk. We're doing a series of talks this summer. I'll share a little more info about that in the next couple slides. But thank you for coming to a Monday talk at a new time. Some of you I recognize are members, some of you are regular visitors, so we're really glad you can join us for this great talk with Dr. Classen and with Makenna Lockwood about Käthe Kollwitz, who they have been helping me with my German pronunciation today. So we're really excited to highlight Kollwitz from the UAMA collection. Before we get started, it is always important to us to recognize that the University of Arizona sits on the homelands of indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial, including the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaqui. And we recognize the 22 sovereign nations of what is now called Arizona. Aligning with the university's core value of a diverse and inclusive community, it's our responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the people, culture, and history that make up the Wildcat community. And at the institutional level, we must be proactive in broadening awareness throughout campus and beyond to ensure our students feel represented and valued. So we appreciate you being here with us today. And if you are joining us from another part of the world or from Tucson, feel free to say hello in the chat. Let us know where you are. Maybe you happen to know whose native lands you are residing on. It's always a good exercise to research that and learn about where you are living. So a couple Zoom reminders before we dig in. We're all experts at Zoom now, right? But just a reminder, you might want to adjust your settings. The view options at the top of your screen allow you to do side by side so you can see the slides and the person talking, and speaker view makes it so you can just see that speaker and not everybody else. We encourage you to leave your videos off to keep everyone's video quality good today. And there'll be time for questions and answers at the end of the talk, but feel free to chime in or add questions in the chat throughout the talk. We'd love to hear from you. I did say that we have some upcoming events. So we're doing 3 talks in a summer series this summer, as well as continuing with our virtual art trivia happy hours. We'll put a link in the chat to our events page, and we hope to see you at more events this summer. Just so you know, with the couple talks that we're having this summer, we are inviting back Drs. Black and Keefe from the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. If you remember, you might have seen their talk on African-American art history this past semester, and they'll be giving us sort of a hybrid history and art talk about the histories of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States, both sort of systemic barriers and also and achievements as artists. And then in August, we'll be talking about what art gets wrong about the Bible, a look at artistic depictions of New Testament narratives. And that'll be a great conversation hosted by our curator, Olivia Miller, and Dr. Jamie Gunderson in Religious Studies at George Mason University. So lots of food for thought this summer, and as well as happy hour coming up next week. So register, and we hope to see you at future events. So I'll quickly just introduce Dr. Albrecht Classen, a distinguished university distinguished professor in German studies. You may have seen him give talks. He's one of our favorite advocates here at the museum, and we appreciate his interest in our collection and always doing such a great job teaching and helping others learn about the great pieces in this collection and learn a new dimension about the historical context that led to their creation. And he's an expert in his area is medieval studies and anything related to the medieval time period, but he has a wide-ranging expertise, I'll say, from experience. So we hope to have him back in the future. And Makenna Lockwood is also joining us. They worked on an independent study this past semester, developing this talk among other projects. And Makenna is a past intern at UAMA, and we're happy to have her back. She is a double major in German studies and art and visual culture education, and we're congratulating her on graduation this past month. So congrats, Makenna, and we're happy to have you. So with that, I will pass it off to you two to take over, and thanks again for being here, and thanks to everyone.
All right. Thank you so much. I hope this sounds well. And I'm very happy to start this project together with you. This is a wonderful outcome of a semester-long independent study. Makenna was one of my students, and I'm very proud to say that she initiated this project, and I was very happy to go along. And it is a wonderful situation where independent study and research come together, and we can present here some really wonderful findings. I would like her to lead this a little bit, and but I really thank her for being such an open-minded and investigative and curious and inquisitive person. This is really what research is all about. That's what the university is all about. And we both are extremely happy that we can share what we have found out, what we have studied together with the community, because what would be our world without arts? I mean, it's so clear, it's self-evident, but I think we need to emphasize this one more time. And the history of art really gives us an access code to everything that is human. So thank you so much. And Makenna, quickly to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Willa, for introducing us, and thank you, Dr. Classen. I wholeheartedly agree. This independent study was kind of my way and to combine my different disciplines and my interests of art history and German studies. And so today, it's culminating in this talk today where we will be presenting to you a very important German artist, one that expressed tragedy and trauma in a very meaningful and interesting way. And so, yeah, without further ado, I will share.
And one of the greatest things that really brings us all together, Käthe Kollwitz's work is present to some extent in our museum. So shout out really big and loud to our Museum of Art. This is a fantastic site. I would strongly recommend, of course, you all know about it, but it is a fantastic site to study art and to enjoy the best, the oldest and the most recent. And so we feel really honored that you make all that wonderful material available. And Willa, thank you so much for having us. On to the first slide then.
Yes. All right.
Okay. So here we present ourselves. This is an artist we would like you all to know about, Käthe Kollwitz. She is or was one of the major voices of human suffering, a major contributor to expressionist art in Germany. So this is what we will do today and move on first. Now, we have a lot of knowledge about her, and what is so wonderful for us is to discuss art not always through the typical male perspective, but rather we have here a major expressionist female artist. We have here two pictures showing her, and we don't go too much into her biography, but the key thing is to know that she lived before the sort of the lifespan before the turn of the 20th century. She went through all the horrible times, First World War, but she also went through the Weimar Republic, Nazi regime, and she died later in Federal Republic of Germany. Okay, next slide. We have lots to talk about. And this is also my part. We will always switch, sometimes myself and then Makenna. And hopefully we'll be able to have some discussions afterwards. and we'll be able also to answer questions later, maybe via email or whatever you want. But our hope really is that after this talk, you will walk directly straight to the Museum of Art and look at Käthe Kollwitz. We begin here with a major monument, the Neue Wache, the New Guard, that is in central part of Berlin. And it used to be in East Berlin. And since 1993, it is a museum or memorial site dedicated to the victims of war and human suffering. And when we go, next slide, when we go right into it, it is a very stark room, but I think one of the most impressive art spaces one can imagine. For art, you don't need necessarily a lot of details. Sometimes the absolute beauty rests in the void, and where just one monument rests there. Käthe Kollwitz was very dedicated to the experiences of a mother. She herself lost her son. We'll talk more about that in the early days of World War I. And she presents here something which is called a pietà. A pietà is an Italian term which represents the Virgin Mary holding her dead son, Christ, in her lap. And Käthe Kollwitz presents herself with basically her dead son as a new Virgin Mary suffering and expressing her deep pain in this famous sculpture. So you can find it today in the heart of Berlin. And so Käthe Kollwitz has risen really as one of the major spokesperson of modern German art. Next slide.
All right. So before we move on and see some more of her work, just a little bit about her life and her biography. So Käthe Kollwitz was born Käthe Schmidt in Königsberg in 1867. Now, Königsberg was a Prussian city, but today it is now a Russian city named Kaliningrad. And her father really recognized her artistic talents very early. So she began taking lessons early in life. And she initially studied to become a painter and worked under several different painters and enrolled at several different academies. At that time, I believe she was only able to enroll at women's academies of art, but she was able to hone her skills there when she was very young. And you can see on the right, this is a piece, one of the pieces in UAMA's collection. It is her self-portrait, one of her many self-portraits. Then in 1888, she became engaged to Dr. Karl Kollwitz, and they married in 1891. And the couple then moved to Berlin, where he opened a practice, and they lived in an apartment at the same address, where she would go on to live until 1943, just 2 years before the end of her life. She turned to graphic art soon, very soon after, and she moved away from painting really because of the influence of several other printmakers and the influence of the writings of different artists on drawing and on the benefits of this different art style over painting. And so she finished her first complete print cycle in 1897. It was titled Ein Weberaufstand, or A Weaver's Revolt. And it really brought her her first big artistic breakthrough, but it also angered Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was the ruler of Prussia at the time, because of its critical nature of the treatment of working class peoples in Prussia. And so he did not like it. He was very angered by it, but it brought her artistic success. And so from then on, really in the period between 1901 and 1913, she had a lot of success exhibiting her work, and she started incorporating sculpture into her practice. But her life changed entirely when in 1914, her son Peter died as a volunteer in World War I. She was obviously devastated by this loss, and through the war, she became a pacifist, which she would be for the rest of her life. And much of her work after the death of her son focused on death, mourning, the effect of war on families, and as Dr. Classen already mentioned, this relationship between mother and child. In 1919, she became the first woman elected to the Prussian Academy of Arts. So there's this step forward where she was kind of groundbreaking in her ability as a female artist to gain as much notoriety as she did at the time. And really, she was at the zenith of her fame during her lifetime, around her 60th birthday. But everything changed again when the National Socialist Party came onto the scene. And she and her husband opposed the Nazis from the start. They opposed their ideology, and they actually, with a coalition of other prominent citizens, they tried to get the other parties to form a union in order to thwart the majority of the National Socialist Party, but that, of course, did not work. And so in 1937, the Nazis removed Kollwitz's work from at least 11 different German museums as part of their Entartete Kunst campaign, or degenerate art campaign. And they really made her and her husband's life very difficult. They threatened them. They suspended Dr. Kollwitz's medical license at one point and prevented her from exhibiting. And so it really, of course, deeply impacted their lives and her career. And sadly, she died just 2 weeks before German surrender in World War II in 1945. So she didn't get to see the end of the war, but she lived through much hardship and she continued to work throughout all of it. Now, this is just an image of Königsberg when it was still Königsberg. So you can just see a little bit of what it looked like, the kind of architecture. And then this is a modern day map of where it is. So you can see Kaliningrad is in this tiny little sliver of Russian territory between Lithuania and Poland. And it's right there. This body of water here is the Baltic Sea. And so it's right there. It's a coastal city.
What I would like to add is, for those of you who would like to get a little bit better sense of Königsberg or Kaliningrad, it was a major university town. And you might remember that Immanuel Kant, the famous German philosopher, taught in Königsberg. So yeah, okay, if you go back one more time there. So what we observe in the late 19th century, and in this regard, Käthe Kollwitz becomes a major spokesperson for many different social movements, was that Germany, like many other parts of the Western world, went through a major paradigm shift, which we could simply identify with the Industrial Revolution. And this Industrial Revolution had huge impact on people. You have a pauperization, you have a mass movements into cities, but also deep troubles because new machineries came in, and particularly the large section of weavers suffered badly. Weaving or any kind of textile work used to be a major source of income, particularly in what we would call today Eastern Europe or Southern Europe. And the modern industrialization made it impossible for these people to find jobs. Now, Käthe Kollwitz was not a witness to the so-called Weavers' Uprising in 1844, part of the revolutionary years during the middle of the 19th century, but there was a major German writer, a dramatist, a playwright, Gerhard Hauptmann, who created this play, The Weavers, and dealt with the Weavers' Uprising. And Käthe Kollwitz saw this play and was deeply moved by it, and so she started creating these lithographs or charcoal drawings or etchings. I think Makenna already indicated how much Käthe Kollwitz was experimenting in many different art forms. And so we see here a dramatic example of this expressionist artist who, that as the word itself says, the expressions, she wants with her art to allow people to sense the suffering of the people on the lower level. And so you see, of course, the poor mother carrying the child, and you see the workers protesting. You can see how haggard they look. So hunger and impoverished life conditions find vivid expressions in her expressionist art. Okay, next one. The Weaver Uprising, as I mentioned, this comes now, slowly one by one. Gerd Hauptmann was the most important playwright of his time. He won actually the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was still very much into naturalism. He just presented conditions, social conditions, without necessarily expressing social concerns. Next. Then he was very interested, as I mentioned, in the Weavers' Uprising. This is just now a little review of what I was just saying. And what then happens is, through the literary impression, Käthe Kollwitz found a way to express herself. It is a reminiscence of the revolution of 1848. So that is not yet connected with the Industrial Revolution, which sets in Germany, Austria, and other parts, maybe Poland and Bohemia in the 1870s, 1880s. But the revolution of 1848 was already the first major attempt to liberate Germany from the royal repression. And the weavers had, of course, their major consequences. Next one. And she was, and again, Makenna mentioned that already, but of course, the ruling class didn't like her at all. And William II called her art simply gutter art. So he did not like to be provoked. He did not like this voice of a major artist, particularly of a woman. This was beyond all social standards. And so that makes really her art so important. But people recognized there was a new voice. And to contrast this a little bit, we do have major movements in art history. On the one hand, we have the rise of realism and naturalism. On the left, for example, which was more idyllic and representative and showing aestheticized nature. On the other hand, I have here Munch with his very famous painting, The Scream. So you have this strong contrast between, on the one hand, I would say mimetic art, which shows just nice representation of nature, people, and so forth, whereas expression and a much more powerful approach to art. And Käthe Kollwitz joined the expressionist movement. Next.
Oh, all right. So yes, she was an expressionist, and German Expressionism in general was a very important part of the early 20th century art. And there was the wider, Expressionism, and then German Expressionism had many of its own identities. So again, it really emphasized the expression of feelings and ideas, an artist's inner world over a replication of reality, of what could be seen, contrasting, again, the depiction of everyday reality that realism offered and the detailed description of the seen world that naturalism attempted to offer. And there was also a desire to kind of shock the viewers because they were rejecting and rebelling against stiff social values at the turn of the century, and also these traditional values of state-sponsored art academies. They were trying to create something new that was their own. Formally, a lot of expressionist art involved simplified shapes, bright colors that often contrasted with each other, were very unnatural seeming, very gestural marks and brushstrokes, meaning very spontaneous, full of movement, just loose and full of life, trying to capture the moment. There were several major groups and styles within German Expressionism. A couple of them include Die Brücke, which was headed up by an artist, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, that he painted this piece right here in the lower left. And then there was also Der Blaue Reiter, which was led by Wassily Kandinsky and Franz Marc. They focused more on abstracted forms and very bright prismatic colors. But Kollwitz didn't really fit into any of these groups. She was drawing influence from both expressionist artists, such as Ernst Barlach, who was the artist who created this print on the right here, and also drew from naturalist ideas. I mean, she did start off as a painter, so much of her work is very detailed and somewhat naturalistic, but she learned how to incorporate both. And her compositions did become simpler as she got older because she was trying to emphasize the emotionalism and create a greater sense of immediacy in her later pieces as she evolved as an artist.
All right, and a little bit for the historical background. I've mentioned already the rise of the Industrial Revolution, which then affected or impacted Germany very much since about 1870s. A major event was the war between Prussia and Germany. Sort of Prussia managed to unify Germany and lead them all in a war campaign against France. And then in 1871, this army then defeated the French. They conquered Paris and Versailles and promulgated the Second Empire, and which was then led primarily by Prussia, with the exclusion of Austria. And what the whole thing meant that people became rich and content. There was a rise of commonwealth. And so you could say when the First World War then broke out in 1914, it was regarded by many people as a relief. Finally, the liberation from this stifling world of wealth, of growing wealth, of industrialization, of colonization, and so forth. Next one. Makenna, next one.
Sorry, it wasn't responding.
And you might know, for example, how much steel and coal mattered very much. This was in the so-called Ruhr district, northwestern Germany. And lots of people then moved into the cities because workers were needed. So you have a massive influx, for example, of Polish workers to the west. Next slide. And you have also, of course, lots of new scientific inventions. The chemical industry, for example, with all the major, let's say, German chemical companies, Bayer, Merck, and so forth. And the pharmaceutical industry develops. The next one. And you have, at the same time, these huge new cities, as I mentioned before, the popularization, because these people, of course, had to work, as we would call it today, at minimum wage, and yet they came from the countryside to find a new future. So all that is the social background upon which we have to understand Käthe Kollwitz's work. Next. You might call it, of course, imperialism. It is the time when the Western powers, England, France, Portugal, Spain, and a little bit Germany, tried to colonize the world. Germany was a little bit behind and basically failed in that endeavor. But it is always to be kept in mind, this imperialism, this global perspective, okay? And next, that's a colonialism. We can move on. Next one right away. And all of that, of course, led to this European-wide conflict, which ultimately led to then the First World War. the race for world domination. And so that erupted then in the First World War in 1914. And we heard already that Käthe Kollwitz was one of those who suffered badly because her son Peter died in that war. All right, next one. This also, of course, meant the militarization of society with heavy steel industries and weapons productions, particularly in Germany and England. So all that has to be kept in mind. We can go more to details, but we want to focus more next on the art. We have an interesting contrast. On the one hand, as Makenna already mentioned, we have the naturalism. And on the other hand, we have, or not on the other, but parallel to it, we have something we call historicism. Historicism is sort of a movement where the architects had suddenly everything available to them, and they did not really have their own style. Instead, they copied and imitated. And they have that Renaissance style, you have Baroque style, you have more modern features, classicism, mixing and merging everything without really having a strong sense of their own. Next one, just to give you the idea. So Potsdam, for example, imitating the Middle Ages, bringing in Renaissance. Next one, it is sort of very representative, and the buildings represent the power of the new industry, of the new state. This is very much an imitation of a Gothic church, or Romanesque church rather. Next one. And then, of course, Neuschwanstein, which you all know. And this is the greatest, and pardon me for saying that, the greatest kitsch ever produced in art history was King Ludwig of Bavaria, or Louis, building an imitation of something which never really existed in the Middle Ages. But this is sort of what you then saw at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, against which the Expressionists particularly revolted. So this historicizing paintings, the pretense of living in a beautiful past, in Middle Ages actually, which is my expertise. So I find this sometimes rather upsetting looking at these things. And the next picture, I think we have one more. The Dresden, famous Dresden Semper Opera House. You can see the majestic self-representation, money coming in, and self-assurance, the authorities building these massive buildings, and having the artists creating these beautiful paintings from sort of the Middle Ages, as if they lived in an idealized past. Next one. I think we have one more, and then this spectacular Parliament building in Budapest, very neo-Gothic. So everything is neo-Romanesque, neo-Gothic, neo-Renaissance, and we have then the strong sense today, nothing of that kind was authentic. And I think that's extremely important. The Expressionists were saying, we have to come back to our emotions. We have to rip open the pretense, the veil that money and the power have imposed on us. We have to find really the truth behind human existence. Next one.
Right. So thinking about that, this segue, Käthe Kollwitz's work is very raw and very real. And much of that rawness and realness and pain comes from her experiences during the First World War. So the conflict lasted between 1914 and 1918, and it was unlike anything the world had ever seen before. There was a sense of German unity and euphoria in the beginning, like they were marching towards something that was important and that people were rushing to join up. They were very willing to fight for this ideal that they were seeing, and it was a cause that they believed in. It involved the introduction of many new weapons, including machine guns, poisonous gases, and airplanes, which all resulted in an unprecedented level of death and destruction in very gruesome ways. And also just the use of trench warfare was very brutal and difficult. So It was a very, very harsh conflict. There were over 11 million German soldiers who participated, and over 2 million of them died. There were a total of over 7 million German casualties, which included those who were injured, dead, or captured. And that was second in number only to Russia. However, there were equally devastating numbers of casualties among the British and the French. The conflict left nothing untouched, and it was devastating to the European continent as a whole. This resulted, of course, in deep physical and psychological scars for the people of Europe. And young men were coming home with debilitating physical and psychological injuries that marked an entire generation. But as Dr. Classen said, in the beginning at least, the masses were willing to sacrifice their lives to this larger identity of their state. And because they had experienced this long period of peace and prosperity and just boredom, I suppose, they saw this conflict as giving their lives meaning. However, after the war, especially from what resulted after, many were disillusioned and many felt that they had been deceived.
And after the First World War arose then the so-called Weimar Republic, which then lasted only 14 years until then the Nazis took over. We have just to keep that in mind. A lot of political unrest, political strife, unstable governments, high inflation rates, and Käthe Kollwitz lived during those very unstable years the first attempt at a democracy or democratic system in Germany. But the end of the First World War also saw for Germany a massive loss of land to France, to Czech Republic, to Belgium, and so forth, and to Italy. So no wonder that people were very unhappy with the Weimar Republic. And then when it happened, then in 1933, they gave their votes to Hitler. But that's a different topic. We can move on. Next. Then we have also, Germany had to pay huge amounts of reparations. So it was almost a debilitating situation for Germany. And Käthe Kollwitz was right in the middle of all these conflicts, which were reported about all the time. Next. Then this is the Versailles Treaties, which was signed by force in 1919. But anyway, I leave that aside, move on. And we have then ultimately the so-called radicalization of the political factions, the rise of the Nazis. But at the same time, you have very strong groups like the Expressionist artists who tried to defend themselves and stay true to their own voice and their soul. Next. Then, of course, the inflation, that is all well known. You can see a number of very conflictual situations and conditions which made life in Germany or Austria extremely difficult. But no wonder then that the Expressionists came forward and tried their own art to come to terms with the issues affecting practically the life of everyone. Next. Then Black Monday that affected the United States as well. Next. And here we have a couple of examples. Yeah.
Yes. So now that we've explored a lot of history and a lot of the context surrounding Käthe Kollwitz's life and work, I'm going to give a brief overview of the mediums and techniques that she employed, because you'll see, again, she experimented with a lot of different media throughout her career and throughout her artistic practice. And she was primarily a printmaker, but she used 3 different methods. So when you see these different terms under these images, you'll be able to know a little bit about what they entail. So she started off using etching techniques in the beginning because they were most closely linked to painting. They allowed for a lot of detail that she was used to presenting because she studied under a lot of historical painters. And so with etching, basically a design is etched into the printing plate, which is usually some type of metal like copper or zinc. The ink is rubbed into the incisions and the grooves, and then it requires a lot of pressure because the paper is actually embossed into the incised lines. So whatever the ink that's in the grooves that have been carved into the into the plate that's what the image is produced. That's what it comes from. So this piece is called Schlachtfeld. It's an etching, or Schlachtfeld, or battlefield in English. And it is one of the pieces in UAMA's collection, as are the other two on this slide. She moved on from etching pretty soon, and she began experimenting more with the lithograph techniques, which you'll see a lithograph here on the far right. This piece is entitled Tod greift in Kinderschar, or Death Reaches into a Group of Children. And basically, the reason that this piece, it looks like it could have been drawn in, crayon or charcoal or something like that. It looks like a drawing, and that's because the design for a lithograph is drawn directly onto the surface of a flat stone or a metal plate with an oil-based crayon or ink. And then the drawing is then affixed with a chemical reaction through adding different layers of material, and it takes time and drying and all these different layers to basically fix this drawing. And then that drawing is wiped away, leaving just this shadow of it. And the stone is dampened with water, it's inked, and until the ink is thoroughly covering the image, and then the prints can be made. So that's more of a chemical process, and that's why you have this softer look. In the center here, we have a woodcut, and woodcuts are really what probably Kollwitz's most recognizable work is in this style, I would say. And this one is entitled Besuch im Krankenhaus, or Hospital Visit. And it was inspired by images that she saw in her husband, Dr. Kollwitz's practice. And so woodcut is actually the oldest form of printmaking. It's a relief process where knives and other tools are used to carve a design. They carve away the areas that are going to end up being in just the paper, or white, or whatever the color of the paper is. And then the areas that are left in relief, that are left raised, are the areas that are actually inked and then printed. And so you could see in this one, all these blank areas were the recessed areas, and then all the black areas were where the carving was still in relief. And the woodcuts really allowed for the simplification of forms that she was trying to achieve later on, again, for this sense of emotionalism and immediacy and this simplicity that really made her pieces so striking, but without sacrificing legibility, without sacrificing the detail that she still wanted to achieve. So that's just a little bit about her mediums and techniques. So when you see these terms, you can understand what they mean.
So actually, Makenna, if you can go back, I have one more. Yeah. So what you can see here so powerfully expressed are three of the major points of criticism. On the one hand, the worries and the concerns about the massive death in World War I. You see the sick person, probably a worker, and so high mortality amongst the working class. And then, of course, some high mortality amongst children, so child mortality. All the results of, as we would say today, probably failed politics by the government, the results of the Industrial Revolution, the result of horrible conditions, living conditions in these new huge cities. And I think ultimately that is, so for me, strikes me the most is that Käthe Kollwitz tried to use her art to express her empathy, her her feelings, her pain. In other words, that is the artist of pain and suffering, and yet she uses her art to translate that pain into something aesthetically powerful. I don't want to say pleasing, it's certainly not pleasing ever, but powerful, moving, and thereby she becomes a voice. I think that is the highest accolade we can give to artists, if they become a voice. And that's what I think is so powerful about Käthe Kollwitz. Next slide.
Absolutely.
So she was a social critic. As I mentioned, she engaged with the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, which was really a paradigm shift in the entire Western world, and also deeply affected Germany. Next. Then she was really a strong adherent of socialist thinking. Next. So Karl Marx, you have to remember, was a very big voice, and Friedrich Engels, and they published a lot of their work. So communism was on the rise, and of course then transformed Russia in 1917, and there were strong communist parties in Germany against which later the Nazis fought vehemently. So you have these two extreme groups, fascism and communism, raging through Germany at that time. Next. And here is then a quote where she was expressing how much she as a woman was deeply moved by the situation, and she demanded the right as a female artist to express herself and to be recognized for, as you were saying, for her fight for freedom and peace. So she was really, we would say today, she was, in modern terms, she was a very strong opponent to the military-industrial complex. It's not only Eisenhower who observed that in 1961, it was already very much in place in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Okay, next. Calling for peace, stop all this massive slaughter. And they are, in a way, this kind of stunning, very current psychoanalysis and historians have discussed increasingly that the entire First World War was basically an attempt to slaughter millions of men. They all knew that they were going to be slaughtered. There's no chance you have against nerve gas, machine gun, grenades, and area bombing. So no wonder that millions of young men died. But Käthe Kollwitz said, stop, we cannot continue with this. Next. And so here you have a very moving image. This is in commemoration of one of the leaders of the communist groups in Berlin, Karl Liebknecht, who was murdered in 1920. This piece is now in the Art Institute in Chicago. And you can see how much she was almost a propagandist, or trying to bring up to our awareness major social issues. So however you view communism, however you think about maybe Karl Liebknecht, but here you can see an artwork that gives vent to the suffering of the survivors who mourn the death of one of those slaughtered fighters for freedom, justice, and equality. Next.
Right, and so Kollwitz, a big part of her activism, of course, as we've been saying this whole time, was anti-war. She was very much against conflict, against war. And so probably her crowning, at least what she considered her crowning achievement in terms of expressing her feelings and expressing these ideas through her art, was this print series that she created and just entitled Krieg, or War. She worked on it between 1918 and 1922, and it was finally published in 1923. She tried to capture what it was like to live through those, in her words, unspeakably hard times from many different perspectives. And so she was trying to cover a spectrum of how war affected families, of how it affected married people, children, mothers, young people. And she was, of course, inspired by her own grief, inspired by the loss of her son. But really, again, she was trying to be a voice. She was trying to show what it was like how much suffering these conflicts caused, and how they changed her society. And so this piece is the sheet from this series that UAMA has in their collection, Die Freiwilligen, or the Volunteers, and again, published in 1923. And really, to me, this is an interesting piece because it captures that sense that we were speaking about before of almost this desperation to volunteer. There's this strange kind of ecstasy in this piece where there's this hysteria where they're kind of scrambling over each other. They have their hands on their shoulders and their faces are kind of just blank, and they're just they're desperate to volunteer for this war. And there's this sense of chaos and violence. And then you have this devilish figure on the left. It's a skeletal face, almost as if like the specter of death is leading the charge of these young men that are trying to join up. They're blind and unable to understand what they're getting into.
The slaughter of the innocent.
Right, exactly. And so this piece is from her post-war period. She was very active and vocal, and part of her activism was the creation of posters that supported various causes and organizations that she believed in and that matched her ideals. And so this piece is probably one of her most recognizable images because of its life was extended beyond its original purpose. Nie wieder Krieg, or Never Again War, from 1924 was created for the Central German Convention of Young Socialist Workers, but it was reappropriated and became an icon of the peace movement after World War II. So it lasted long and much later into the 20th century as this icon of peace, of pacifism, and of anti-war ideas. And this quote here, another one, this one taken directly from her diaries, captures a lot of what she felt and a lot of what she was trying to convey. She said, Peter, her son, they all devoted their lives to the idea of patriotism. The young men in England, Russia, and France did the same. The result was an impoverished Europe robbed of its most beautiful people. Was the youth in all these countries deceived? And so again, there's this kind of deception where they were all told, or they all believed that they were participating in something that was greater than themselves. But in the end, there was just this immense amount of loss and this absence and just the families that were left behind.
So I just want to alert us both that we are now 5 to 4 almost, so we need probably to wrap up very soon, maybe also to have a few more minutes left for questions and answers. So let's go through the next slides fairly quickly. I just refer here quickly to Bertha von Suttner, the most important and outspoken peace activist at that time. We need these people once again. I would say we need Bertha von Suttner. We need Käthe Kollwitz once again. They are so powerful, and their statements so powerful in a world where the military rules everything. But anyway, that is a political statement by me, and so disregard it for right now. Next one.
These are 2 other sheets from her war series. I just wanted to show a bit of a breadth of what they looked like. And this one, the parents, and then the widow. So again, just a view into how the war affected different facets of society, different facets of family life.
You can clearly see why the Nazis didn't like her.
Right.
They regarded her as a defeatist, so as a dangerous voice who undermined their efforts to conquer the world. So I'm afraid she would be regarded from the same perspective by many different social and economic circles in our country today. But that makes art great when the messages contained transcend historical limitations. So next. So we have here our conclusions. Maybe I start and then you, Makenna. So we have with Käthe Kollwitz truly a major female German artist, one of the best representatives of Expressionism. Next.
Right. And again, a spokesperson for peace. She fought for it her whole life. She was immensely brave, even against the Nazis who were pressing back against her and tried to basically ruin her and her husband's life. She continued to work and continued to try to get her message out against all of that.
And just to sum up, she was became the major artist who fought with her work for social justice and equality. She is basically a voice we understand today. She would be the best artist today for our social political movements. Once again, this is just sort of the incredible impact she has had.
And again, just this commitment to pacifism, commitment to peace in the face of so much violence in her lifetime.
Mm-hmm. And of course, she comes from a very personal perspective. That is a woman who lost her own son. What greater pain can you suffer as a woman but to lose your own child? But not because of sickness, and not because of murder or an accident, but because of state-organized military operations, sacrificing millions of young people. Next.
And she continued to be a voice for other people in society who were unable to speak for themselves or who were not listened to, including workers, including the poor and people who didn't have the means or the power to fight for themselves. And she always tried to represent their stories and their needs.
So, and I would like just to express my thanks to Makenna. She was the one who brought up this topic, and we started actually with the early Middle Ages and ran all the way to the very current time with Gerhard Richter. And so thank you, Makenna. This was an incredibly exciting and wonderful project. So I think you are one of my best students I've ever had. So I'm sad to see you leave, but I'm happy also that we both could do this together as our final project.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the chance to do it. I really got to have, it was my dream independent study. I got to have so much fun with this project with Dr. Classen, and this, as a person who loves museums and wants to work in a museum, this is also a great experience for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So, and thank you to the Museum of Art. Thank you, Willa, for allowing us to do this. This was wonderful, and we really appreciate this great opportunity.
Thank you both so much for being here and for giving this really great survey of such a unique artist. It's so interesting to hear about her in the context of German Expressionism, and then thinking about, you know, like the Bauhaus movement, movement towards abstraction and modernism later, that she was such a unique voice in her focus on her medium of printmaking and, you know, dedication to really a lifelong project of expressing the ideas she was expressing. So thanks for sharing both the visual and the historical context for that. I see a couple quick questions, and thank you all. It is 4 o'clock, so we understand if you want to move on with your day, but I'll share a couple questions if you don't mind staying on the call, Albrecht and Makenna. Let me see if I can make myself appear.
Well, thank you to the audience. I really appreciate that you gave us this forum so we could introduce this fantastic artist.
Absolutely.
So one person asked early on in your talk, looking at her influences, do you know if she might have been aware of Van Gogh's graphic work in Les Borinage? Is that anything you came across of any of her inspirations or things she was seeing early on in her training?
Um, she, I'm sure she was probably aware. She was deeply entrenched in the art world and academic art. So she was very much aware of everything that was going on at that time and before. So I have no doubt that she knew of that. She was very influenced by other graphic artists, other printmakers, but drew influences from many different places.
Yeah,
Berlin was the center of cultural developments. So absolutely, she studied, she was in contact with lots of different other artists you learn. So absolutely, we cannot really pinpoint who now influenced her direct in this regard. I think she stands on her own feet, and that's the most important.
No, it's interesting to learn of her her academic background, Makenna, and also her interest in painting at the beginning of her training, but then to really see how she is such a single-minded graphic artist. And probably, I mean, I kind of maybe make an assumption that that was also a choice based on how it would be more easy to disseminate that so much of her art was about sharing a message, which is what printmaking is really the medium to do that in. Someone comments, Gloria comments that people are using her art in the contemporary peace movement, and including some of the series you shared. So we can really see why, it would continue to have resonance today, where unfortunately, we've continued to create increased technological advances in warfare that continue. So continues to be an important message.
For any artist, if his or her artwork continues to speak to us today, and she does.
Yeah, very much so. A couple more comments that I'm just seeing, basically praise for you all. Thank you for sharing this. Alicia shares that she stumbled upon a museum dedicated to her work in Berlin, and the experience of viewing her work was palpable, a stunning body of work. And if you've traveled, if anyone in the audience, if you've traveled and seen her work, you can see it in many major museums, and let us know what that was like.
Cologne has the largest collection. Berlin has one as well. So I would be very happy to take a whole group of people, and we travel to Germany when we can. So keep that in mind.
That sounds like a good trip. Definitely to organize. Well, I guess I'll just wrap up by saying I know you included a couple quotes from her. I didn't know if there were any writings by her or others that you would point us towards for further reading.
So the museum in Cologne, and it has its own website. There's a Käthe Kollwitz museum. So if you look up Käthe Kollwitz museum, they have a huge body of work on their website. They have their full collection pretty much. So you can see as much of her work as you like. And they also have a lot of her writings on that website. So the Käthe Kollwitz Museum, you'll be able to find. And if there aren't the writings that you're looking for, I'm sure that website could point you to larger bodies of work.
Great. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, both of you, and thank you everyone for being here today. I'll just, say it again. We really appreciate your time. And I didn't know if you had any final words, Dr. Classen or Makenna.
What is art? Art is not something just to look at. We have always studied throughout our entire semester what makes real art. And if art is only decorative, that's what I would call with Walter Benjamin, mimesis. That has nothing to say. It is just decoration. Käthe Kollwitz proves to us what true art is. It speaks, it fights, it opens perspectives, it battles, and it is there for people. It is not just simply for those who have money, but it speaks for people. And that's what I find so admirable about Käthe Kollwitz's work. It is timeless, it is very specific at the same time, but it's really universal in its human dimension. That, I think, is the most moving and most powerful. Makenna, how do you see it?
I agree. I think that Käthe Kollwitz is a great example of an artist who used her art for herself, and that I think that she needed to produce art in order to survive the experiences that she went through. And in doing so, I'll echo what you said earlier. She became a voice for so many people who weren't able to speak for themselves. And I think that that's the most honorable and wonderful thing that art can do. And so that's why I think everyone should study her, and that she's a very important artist to highlight throughout history, throughout the world.
Great, well said. Thank you both so much for sharing this research that you did this semester with us and with everyone that's here today. We'll hope to share these summer talks on our YouTube channel. Keep an eye out if anyone, anyone that you'd like to share this video with in the future. But again, I will let us go for the day, but thank you for being here, and I hope to see some of you at future events, and have a great summer. Congrats again on graduation, Makenna.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon and evening.